Good morning. Glad to see everybody turning out this morning. Turning out to be a beautiful day. Great to see a lot of new faces as well as old faces. Encouraged by the big turnout and anxious to hear Jeff's talk about anxiety in the world today. Please feel free to keep eating. There's still a little bit left on the tables. Grab your refills, your coffee, etc. But one of the things our men's leadership team has talked about is incorporating testimonials into our events, our breakfasts and dinners. And we're going to kick that off this morning. And in the spirit of not asking people to do what I wouldn't do myself, I'm going to share a little bit of my story with you this morning. So there's two main things I want to talk about, but a little bit of background first. I grew up in Pottstown, not too far from here. I grew up in what I call a split home. My father was a Lutheran, but never went to church. My mother was a Methodist and always went to church. So there were a lot of mixed messages and confusing messages about faith and religion as I was growing up. So unsurprisingly, when I went off to college at Westchester, religion just got parked on the shelf and I found other things to do with my time. Stayed on that shelf until I was in my early 30s. I got serious, Carol and I got serious about getting married and starting a family. We were living in San Diego at the time. This was 86. We actually got married here at Good Sam in the chapel. Carol grew up in Berwyn, and Good Sam was her church growing up. So that was 86. Eventually, we moved back to the area. We moved to Malvern when our daughters were getting ready to go to school. I got involved with teaching Sunday school. Started going to some men's ministry events, so religion was coming back into my life. So the first thing I want to talk about is what happened at one of the men's retreats. It was probably the year was 2000, 2001. I don't remember the year, I don't remember the speaker, the topic, but what I do remember is after the Saturday evening session, I wanted to get out, get some fresh air, take in the night sky out in Elverson. It's St. Mary's is in the middle of nowhere, so you get a good view of the sky. So I'm leaning back against a tree, taking it all in. Nice, quiet, calm time. And I feel this rush of wind in my face, and I feel the presence of Jesus sitting there with me, taking it in together. And he let me know that as big as that universe is, he cared about me, and he loved me. So what do you do with that? I gathered my wits, went back inside, looked up Father Todd Cederberg, who some of you know, and for the first time in my life, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. So, huge turning point in my life. So then what happened after that? I started living out my faith instead of just being a participant. So one example of that is men's ministry. Instead of just being a participant at the events, I got involved in the leadership. That was 20-some years ago, and I think you guys know how that story ended. I'm still involved in helping facilitate events like this and helping guys make connections and sharing their journey together in their walk with Christ. So, second big thing I want to talk about today is my dealing with cancer, specifically prostate cancer. So I retired I was in software engineering for my career. Retired in June of 2019. So that was June. In August, I got a diagnosis of prostate cancer, aggressive and advanced. Not the greatest news to hear, but I'll talk about the cancer part of it a little bit later, but what I want to talk about primarily and highlight is where I have seen God walking with me and where God has been in that process of dealing with cancer. I think the first thing, first and foremost, it's taught me how to trust God, and the way that has manifested itself. There's a couple things. Isaiah 41, "Fear not, for I am with you," and Psalm 23. I can't tell you how many times I've recited those verses sitting in a waiting room or being in a MRI machine getting a scan done, and just being relaxed and not being anxious about what's going on and what the future holds, but trusting in God to lead me where I'm going to go. There's other ways that trust has shown itself in connections that have been made. I'll give you some examples. When I first started having an elevated PSA, my primary care physician referred me to a urologist to figure out what was going on. In this area, there are hundreds of urologists, but the name he wrote down and handed on this piece of paper was Dr. David Lancioni. I know David Lancioni. I knew him from him attending Good Sam. He sat in the same chairs you're sitting in. He came to breakfast. He went to retreats. So that first appointment with him, we go in and we start talking about Good Sam. We didn't even talk about PSAs and we got around to that, but the first discussion was Good Sam. What's going on there? What are you? He no longer was attending at that time, but so David was the one that did the biopsy and broke the news, "George, you have cancer," and then sat with Carol and I and prayed. So I'm not sure about you, but in my many encounters with the medical profession, that's a rare thing. And it was just very comforting to be able to sit with somebody I trusted and knew. I couldn't have picked a better messenger than the one God picked for me in that case. Another example, Sid Buck and I, many of you know Sid Buck, were having breakfast at Nudi's. This was when I had my prostate removed. Things were in remission for about a year and a half, and then my PSA levels started going up again. And before we chose the next treatment option, I wanted to have a second opinion. And Sid and I were talking. I was telling him I had contacted Penn Medicine but hadn't heard back yet. You know, I wasn't sure if I was getting lost in the shuffle, whatever. Kept talking, and then somebody comes up to us as they're leaving, and he said, "Sorry, couldn't help but overhear your conversation, but I'm a doctor at Penn Medicine in Valley Forge." He gave me a phone number and a name to call, and sure enough, got through all the red tape, and long story short, we're now getting, my treatment is managed through Penn Medicine. Coincidence? Maybe. I believe it's God, because I put my trust in Him, putting me in touch with people that then I can trust. And it's been a very sweet blessing as I'm going through all this. So now back to the cancer part of things. Prostate cancer's in the news this week. Secretary of Defense chose not to disclose that he was being treated for cancer. Big blow up about that. So all I'll say is pay attention to your PSA. Most of the people in this room should probably be getting their PSA tested as part of their annual physical lab work. Pay attention to it when it goes over 4.0. You need to figure out what's going on. It could be that you need to do nothing after you get more information, but don't ignore it. There's a lot of debate in the medical community about over-treating prostate cancer, and some of the treatments in the past were pretty severe with side effects and all. I'm very optimistic about the future of cancer treatments, and specifically prostate cancer. There's a lot of research and money being poured into looking at different treatments, and I think we've reached a tipping point with success in not only containing cancer, but actually eliminating cancer. I think last November at one of these, our last breakfast, we heard Chris Pack talk. Chris Pack is kind of right in the middle of that research and rolling out some of these new therapies, getting them publicized and available to people that can really make a big impact. So I'm very hopeful around that. And again, for me, it's in God's hands, and we'll see where things go with that. So I'm going to wrap it up, but I have one final shout out that I want to do. We always talk about the importance of men connecting with other men and having events like this where we can have fellowship and sharing. But I wouldn't be here today without the support of Carol, my partner in life. When I look for the image of God in the world today, someone who has that loving and serving heart, I don't have to look very far. And I can't thank God enough for that blessing. So, thank you, and
let me just give a little overview of what I hope to accomplish here today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about trends in youth mental health that I think demonstrate a kind of emerging anxiety or fragility in younger generations. And I think that makes it sort of harder for us to achieve certain versions of happiness or the good life. So I want to talk about those trends. Then I want to explore some explanations for those trends on offer. And then I want to propose what I believe to be maybe some deeper cultural roots of those trends. And then take a sort of theological turn, actually, to make some suggestions for sort of living through this age of anxiety. And I hope to have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So hopefully we can have some discussion among ourselves about this as well. So first, a disclaimer, though. I am not the helpful kind of doctor. So I'm not a therapist. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not even a psychologist. I'm probably even worse. I'm a sociologist, which makes me perhaps less helpful in kind of practical things here. But as a sociologist, I'm sort of more interested in understanding the cultural significance of these trends and what they mean for us and for the society in which we live. So if you came looking for prescriptions or highly practical solutions, I'm probably not your guy. And so if you were lured here on false pretenses, at this point you've been fed, you've had your coffee, and if you want to sneak out, you can. I won't be offended. But hopefully we'll have some things to talk about here. this morning. So let me first start with some general definitions. I'm going to be talking about generations a little bit here, and so whenever we do this, it's helpful. I don't know how well you can all see this, but I'll try to talk through most of these. So I'm going to talk a lot about Gen Z, which is this youngest generation. So those are folks, these are all kind of subjective categories, but in general, we're talking about folks born from 97 to 2012. So this is a little old, but so most of these, like that group is now maybe age 11 to 25, 26. And then you can see, based on your birth year, you can, if you're not sure what generation you're a part of, you can place yourself here. And one of the great things about a group like this is probably have representatives from just about all of these generations, which again is one of the great things about the church. There's not a lot of places, I'm guessing, if you're like me, there's not a lot of opportunity that you have to be in settings where you've got people from all of these different generations. But so we're going to talk a little bit about Gen Z, and those are mainly folks who are between the ages of 12 and 26 at the moment. So let's get started. The kids are not all right, so the data say. ER visits for self-harm by kids and teens from 2009 to 2019 experienced this pretty noticeable spike, and especially for girls. A lot of these trends, I'll try to break some of it out by gender, and it seems to, many of these trends seem to affect girls even worse. And the other thing I want to note is a lot of the data that I'll show is pre-COVID. So it's pretty safe to assume that in as much as we're seeing trends, and I'm showing you data for the decade that sort of ended just before COVID, a lot of these things are probably, as more data come out, one would expect a lot of these trends to even increase. The government and the press have taken notice of these trends, and a kind of crisis narrative has emerged over the last, say, 12 to 24 months. We're seeing lots of articles and attention given to these trends. This one actually just came across my desk. Came out last month. The Pew Charitable Trust put this magazine out, taking a look at some of these trends. And so, of course, media love crisis narratives because it, gets clicks and things. But it does seem to be sparking a public conversation. The CDC released a report about a year ago, and again, included pre-COVID data. And this is looking at high school students, okay? So I'll show, I'll try not to get your eyes to gloss over with all these charts, but so generally we're looking at a trend here. And some of these, I would say some of these things that I'll show you, may be marginal, but I think there's, the aggregate is sort of certainly showing a trend in a certain direction. So this one, again, high school students in the decade 2009 to 2019. Persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness in the past year has gone up. You split that out by gender. That top line is girls, bottom line is boys. Seriously considered attempting suicide is up, and again, broken out by gender. Actual attempts, and broken out by gender. Those are high school. The trends for college students are also similar and have received quite a bit of attention. And for those of you that are on college campuses, I think you probably know this, counselors on college campuses are very busy. It's hard to get appointments with counselors. Most universities don't have enough counselors. And so just a couple of studies to show you about this. This study showed a 50% prevalence increase in seeking help for mental needs. So this is why counselors are so busy. There's a lot more students searching for their services. Another study from a little earlier showed quite significant increases in depression and suicidal thoughts among 18 to 25-year-olds. Again, those are pre-COVID data. And then the American Psychological Association put this little graphic out showing mental health and stress levels for Gen Z as compared to other generations. And again, I don't know if you can see this, but so that red line at the top of this bar here, this is Gen Z. They're least likely to say their mental health is excellent or very good. They're for the most part, their stressors are higher. This is sort of their average stress levels. I'll just note there may be some millennials in the room. On this particular measure, millennials did show a little higher stress than Gen Z. But in general, that's sort of the trend. Now, one just quick specific, this is a psychologist named Peter Gray, and he writes about these trends. So he wrote an article a few years ago on the declining emotional resilience in college students. Okay, so he just wrote it was a blog post about his observations of declining emotional resilience. He got tons of feedback, right? Lots of his readers wrote to share their opinions with him about this trend that he was noting. And so he published the second article summarizing the responses he got from his first article about declining emotional resilience, okay? And he put these responses in 5 different categories, okay? So let me share them with you. So the first group of people who responded to him about declining emotional resilience in college students were high school teachers. So on the whole, he said, the high school teachers complained that parents were too involved, right? Overprotective parenting, and that was the problem. Okay, that was one group. The second group were college professors, and the college professors said that their students were clearly more anxious, less likely to take responsibility for their own work and their own performance. The third group were employers, all right? So employers seem to suggest that kids these days are lousy workers, and they don't take ownership, and they usually blame others for their poor evaluations. The fourth group that responded to him were parents, and guess what? Parents said it's not their fault. And the final group that responded to him were actually the students themselves, and guess what? They also said it's not their fault, okay? So let's assume that there is sort of something going on with these trends. The trends aren't good, and that they point to a certain kind of anxiety or fragility among young people today. We can sort of interrogate that claim and talk about that in our Q&A, but for now, I'm going to make that assumption, and I'm going to kind of move on to some potential explanations for why we see these trends. So this is a book called The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. And those are the authors here, John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. This book came out a few years ago, maybe 2018. Psychologist. They explore the sources of rising fragility in the younger generation. Okay, so they first suggest something they call safetyism. So their argument is that a general lack of resilience among college students may be the result of overprotective parenting. They argue that children are actually anti-fragile and need stressors and challenges in their lives to properly develop. And without them, they become conditioned for fragility. So Haidt and Lukianoff suggest this hygiene hypothesis to demonstrate this point. And they have, I'll tell you about a study that they feature in this book. So they didn't do this study, but so 640 infants in this study who were at high risk to develop a peanut allergy, these infants. And they were at high risk to develop the allergy because they had extreme eczema or they had tested positive for some other allergy. Okay, so the doctor said this group likely, or more likely than others, to develop a peanut allergy. So they took half of the infants and said to the parents, don't give them any peanuts. I have a kid with a peanut allergy, okay? So this study is fascinating to me for this. So they took half the parents and said, don't give them any peanuts, protect them from peanuts. The other half, they said, give them 3 times a week, give them a snack with peanut butter, okay? So the whole population of these infants were high risk for developing the allergy. The ones who were protected from peanuts, 17% of that group developed a peanut allergy. The ones who were exposed, 3% developed the allergy. Okay, so Haidt and Lukianoff sort of used that as an example of the immune system itself requires exposure, right, to develop, and that's how it develops protections against these things, right? And so, by analogy, they suggest that this is also true in general with child development. And one of the challenges or problems is parents have sort of not exposed their kids to enough challenges and stresses. So safetyism was one explanation. The other one is technology, they say. And they suggest that the iPhone, and specifically social media, seem to be associated with higher rates of depression and anxiety, and therefore contribute to a larger culture of fragility. And the connection here that they make is, more time spent on social media creates constant comparisons to others, many of whom we don't know or may not even exist, but it creates higher expectations for oneself, expectations we can never live up to, and that, of course, creates depression and anxiety. And again, the data, so John Haidt is working on another book that should be out soon, specifically on the phone. And he traces these trends to the emergence of the iPhone, which I think was 2006 or something. Does that sound about right? And John has daughters, and so he's actually interested in that gender gap and why it seems to affect girls even more than boys. So those are their 2 explanations, and then they give this sort of little quip: prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. Right? And in as much as we parents sort of try to smooth the road for our children, they think this is part of the problem that creates this culture of anxiety. Then they also suggest their sort of solution is cognitive behavioral therapy, which again, I'm not a psychologist, but basically this is a tool to reframe your perspective, to recognize and reorient negative beliefs and emotions, and think differently about the challenges. And so that's sort of where they land on their prescription. So I think this is all, there's a lot of truth to all of these things. What I want to try to do is suggest that the trends we're seeing have deeper roots in a centuries-old conception of happiness. That may go to the heart of the modern age in which we live. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean here. So this new conception of happiness is dubbed imminent contentment by Benjamin Story and Jenna Story in this book called Why We Are Restless, The Modern Quest for Contentment. So imminent contentment, they argue, emerges around the 17th century. Okay, so this goes way back. as a distinctly modern view of happiness. So it suggests that pleasure, satisfaction, contentment are achievable in the present, in the here and the now. It's not accessible, that kind of contentment, it's not accessible in the afterlife, or only in the afterlife, or only in some transcendent realm. But we can achieve it in the world today, in the present. And so this life itself, the life on the earth, should satisfy the longings of our heart. And this is a kind of new conception that they're pointing to that emerges centuries ago, but is different than the kind of conception of contentment that might have been in the ancient world or in the Middle Ages. So immanent contentment is a kind of moral ideal that they point out. So it should be achievable for all of us here in the present. And it's a normative kind of ideal. We don't really have a choice. We all have sort of pressures. We should strive to achieve this kind of contentment. And why wouldn't we want to? So this ideal of contentment actually lays the groundwork for a new sort of liberal political order in history. And so this is sort of the roots. This version of happiness is the roots of the Declaration of Independence, where we are not just given an opportunity to pursue it, but it's an unalienable right. So in sort of the course of history, we now think about political orders, governments, countries, where we're able to do this. This is a great opportunity for us to achieve. So it lays the groundwork for a new political order. It also lays the groundwork for a new moral order. So this is a picture of a sort of older ideal of the chivalric hero of the warrior aristocracy. Okay. So now, with the vision of immanent contentment, why go off as a knight or a soldier and be a hero in battle, which would have been motivated by a kind of reward in an afterlife, glory in an afterlife? Why do that when I could be warm and comfortable and happy and make a life with a beautiful woman here and now and enjoy my life now? That glory in the afterlife becomes less interesting if I can actually enjoy myself here in the present. So to not seek comfort now may be a little nuts. So the kind of honor that may have been achieved through death on the battlefield seems a little impractical in this vision of immanent contentment. And so the stories in their book argue that this new moral order creates a kind of what's called a bourgeois ideal, the middle class dream that undergirds a lot of modern life for even us today in the 21st century. It's an ideal of sensible material comfort, a good job, nice house, a happy family, and paid vacation. Okay, and it's been a remarkable ideal at that. So I want to show you this this graph. So let me try to explain what you're looking at. So the y-axis here is life expectancy. The x is GDP per capita, which is adjusted for price and inflation. In 1800, each one of those little dots on that screen represents a country. The size of the dot is the population of the country. So most countries in the world, and as much as we had data for this in 1800, most countries in the world had a pretty low life expectancy and relatively low GDP. So most of these countries are sort of clustered in that lower left-hand corner. Here is the USA. Life expectancy in 1800 of 39 years, and a GDP per capita at $3,630. Okay? And so 1800, sort of just as this vision of immanent contentment is really taking hold, the Industrial Revolution is ready to take off. If you move this graph up to last year, or 2 years ago, I guess, 2022. All countries have moved up on the health scale, right? Most countries have also, so we've gotten healthier. Most countries have gotten quite a bit wealthier. The blue countries are, the colors are continents. The blue countries are mainly African countries. So clearly there's quite a bit more inequality. But the US here has moved all the way up here. So life expectancy in 2022 in the US was 79 years. We added 40 years to our life expectancy in that 200-year period. GDP per capita is $64,000. So we've grown quite a bit in health and wealth in 200 years, okay? Better health and better wealth makes this vision of eminent contentment seem highly achievable for all of us. And yet, for all the promise of imminent contentment, the hope of an actually achievable happiness in the here and now, there's discomfort, there's unease, it seems, discontentment that remains. The philosopher Charles Taylor calls this the modern malaise. If happiness and pleasure and comfort are really attainable for me and for everyone, why aren't we all happy? Why rising rates of anxiety? What keeps us from being satisfied? Is it our modern view of happiness? So in some way, might we be victims of our own success? And so I want to read a little bit from this gentleman, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote Democracy in America, visited America in 1830, 31, and he's from France, visited America, traveled all around America in that year he was here, and went back to France and wrote this big volume, Democracy in America. He observed imminent contentment as a kind of middle-class ideal that undergirds our democratic experiment here in America. And he noted a sort of underlying discontent. So let me read this quote for you. In America, I saw the freest and most enlightened men placed in the happiest condition that exists in the world. It seemed to me that a sort of cloud of habitually covered their features. They appeared to me grave, almost sad, even in their pleasures. And I'm going to, I teach Tocqueville here, so I'm going to read, I just can't help but read a little longer quote from Tocqueville. So bear with me here. He says, "It's a strange thing to see what sort of feverish ardor Americans pursue well-being and how they show themselves constantly tormented by a vague fear of not having chosen the shortest route that can lead to it. The inhabitant of the United States attaches himself to the goods of this world as if he were assured of not dying, and he rushes so precipitately to grasp those that pass within his reach that one would say he fears at each instant he will cease to live before he has enjoyed them. He grasps them all, but without clutching them, and he soon allows them to escape from his hands so as to run after new enjoyments." Again, this is all in 1831. In the United States, a man carefully builds a dwelling in which to pass his declining years, and he sells it while the roof is being laid. He plants a garden, and he rents it out just as he was going to taste its fruits. He clears a field, and he leaves to others the care of harvesting its crops. He embraces a profession and quits it. He settles in a place from which he departs soon after, so as to take his changing desires elsewhere. Should his private affairs give him some respite, he immediately plunges into the whirlwind of politics. And when, toward the end of a year filled with work, some leisure still remains to him, he carries his restive curiosity here and there within the vast limits of the United States. He will thus go 500 leagues in a few days in order to better distract himself from his happiness. Death finally comes, and it stops him before he has grown weary of this useless pursuit of a complete felicity that always flees from him. So the quest for eminent contentment appears futile, or at least it did to Tocqueville as he observed Americans in 1831. And yet, today we are still compelled to seek it. It's our duty. It doesn't feel like oppression because we all want it. We live for it, we vote for it, we get jobs and careers for it. And at this point, you're all probably wondering what any of this has to do with anxiety, which was our topic, right? But let me try to connect some dots here. So when the goal of life becomes to enjoy oneself with this particular vision of imminent contentment, the slightest discomfort becomes an affront. The persistence of suffering in such a world becomes a major problem. So what do we do with the experience of dissatisfaction or suffering? What can we do? It drives a restless search for a change. And this is, I think, even what Tocqueville was observing 100 years ago. So we're always looking for something new, something different. Maybe it's the latest version of the iPhone. Maybe it's a new outfit or the next adventure. On vacation, that'll give us the best sort of selfies to post on social media. Maybe it's a new job. Maybe it's moving to a new city. The point is that kind of restlessness, that kind of displacement creates anxiety. And anxiety is sort of built in then to our prosperity in the modern age. Of course, we will feel anxious and fragile in a world that demands imminent contentment. How could we not, really? So the promise of individual freedom and autonomy that's central to the vision of eminent contentment creates its own limits, it seems to me. If we're restless in the midst of our well-being, as Tocqueville says, perhaps it signals that the achievement of unprecedented degrees of freedom, equality, material prosperity, and unlimited choice don't guarantee us contentment. So let me just try to illustrate this. For those of you who are Gen Xers in the room, or maybe even some millennials, you'll recognize these books. Does anyone actually? Yeah? Okay, good. That was the right generation. I think that these books, they were wildly popular books, for kind of kids' books in the 1980s. Choose your own adventure. So you, the reader, you were the main character. And at different points in the story, you could literally choose where you wanted to go. So if you want to go here, jump to page 85. If you want to go there, jump to page 112, and you would finish sort of the story. And so I think these books, at least for many of us, capture this deeply ingrained desire to sort of author your own stories. And yet there was always this sort of fear of missing out. So if I chose this path in the story, what would have happened if I had chose that path? And the nice thing about the books is you could actually go back and read the other one that you didn't choose. But it's harder to do that in real life. And so the fear of missing out from choices we didn't make, the college we didn't choose, the job we didn't take, can fuel the fires of our built-in anxiety. And yet, I think many of us, we still feel compelled to be the author of our own stories and to write our own happiness. And that may be part of our problem. So the philosopher Alistair McIntyre says, we are never more and sometimes less than the co-authors of our own narratives. Only in fantasy do we live whatever story we please. And he goes on to say, for the story of my life is always embedded in the story of those communities from which I derive my identity. I am born with a past, and to try to cut myself off from the past in the individualist mode is to deform my present relationships. And just as an aside, I think this is one of the great things about hearing testimonies, because when George tells us his story, he's telling us those things about himself and the way in which his story has actually been directed not just by him, but by God and others in his life, right? His spouse in his case. So this, it seems to me, is one of the great challenges we face in the modern age. We are compelled to seek a version of happiness that may have fatal flaws precisely because we are compelled to seek it through our own authorship. And yet, we are not the sole authors of our own stories. So in some sense, we are set up for failure in that mode. And that's true for Gen Z, but I think it's also true for all of us, all of our generations, right? We're all living in this sort of modern culture of imminent contentment. Now, if you're an astute listener, you may be asking, well, if this has been a trend building for centuries, why do we see the increase that I showed us at the beginning of this talk in Gen Z? Okay, which is a great question, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk through that. For now, let me just say, I think there's some sense in which imminent contentment, the vision of imminent contentment, was sort of held in check by a pretty strong institutional culture. Think of like a moral safety net, right? So we talk about a social safety net, government programs that can sort of prevent poverty. A moral safety net would be a kind of cultural equivalent, right? There's an institutional ecology, families, churches, Boy Scouts, schools, all those kinds of institutions kind of created a protective hedge of sorts for quite some time. And that institutional ecology may be weakening and crumbling. And that could be some of the explanation for the recent increase. But let me just quickly conclude with a couple of suggestions for seeking true contentment in an age of anxiety. Okay, first, and this is my attempt to get practical with you all, okay? So first, we try to recognize that that imminent contentment is actually a myth. Our fragility and our anxiety it's not your fault or my fault or Gen Z's fault or the teachers or the professors or the parents or the employers or the kids. Somewhere along the way, centuries ago, we all got hooked on a story of happiness, and it set deep roots in our culture. It's the air we breathe. We can't really escape it. But for all the prosperity that story really has achieved, the story may be misleading, and it could be the source, or at least one of the sources, of our discontents. So the second thing I would suggest is that we, especially we in this room, recognize that we're part of another story, and that story is not written by us, and this is the Christian story. That story needs to act as a powerful counter-narrative to the myth of imminent contentment, it seems to me. At the heart of the Christian story is the resurrection. The fact of the resurrection brings a certain and future hope that empowers us to live in the present. So it immediately puts stressors, challenges, discomforts, illnesses that I experience in the present. It puts those into context. I was thinking of this as George told his story a little bit, right? When we encounter these things, George had a sort of story, and in fact met with a doctor who shared the same story, and that helps put into context these challenges that we face. It helps us make sense of them, and that's something that the sort of vision of imminent contentment can't do. So the resurrection becomes a way of seeing, a way of looking and living in the world that should open our eyes to the gifts of grace, even in the midst of our discomforts. Because if the resurrection is true, we know that redemption comes out of injustice and life comes from death. And I can have a certainty that suffering can produce joy and weakness can produce strength. And that's a very different kind of contentment. It doesn't focus on material comforts. It doesn't leave me to my own devices to find happiness. And it doesn't require me to write my own ending. But it does reframe how I understand myself and my circumstances. So if we can see grace, then we can see through our present circumstances, whatever they may be, to contentment rooted in gratitude for God's work in our lives. And so that's not necessarily a prescription for surviving the age of anxiety, but I do think it's a very helpful antidote, and I think that the church, this church, and groups like these are ways that we can remind ourselves of that story.